Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tianwei's special program at the China Development Forum 2017. It is impossible to change the direction of the wind, but certainly it is helpful to get to know where the wind is blowing and sail safely to the destination. How to do that? With us, we have a panel of gentlemen with wisdom. Probably they can help us to understand better why there's the rise of protectionism and populism in the world, why there's so much anxiety about globalization, why there's a growing gap between the rich and poor, the losers and the winners, and why there are so much strong interaction between politics and economics today. And I'm very honored to have 4 Nobel Prize in economics sitting here with me today, certainly lightening up our studio. Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate for the year 2001.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Professor Michael Spence, laureate of Nobel Prize in economics, also for the year 2001. The both of you share it. Great to have you.
Nice to be here.
Professor Christopher Pissarides, he taught me how to pronounce his name, for the year 2010, the latest among you all. And last but certainly not least, Professor Edmund Phelps for the year 2006. Gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to have all of you here. You were joking with one another before our taping. I hope we're going to have a pleasant time now. I want to start with you, Professor Stiglitz. You were writing your book more than 10 years ago about the anxieties related to globalization. Is that what you're seeing today?
Yes, the way globalization was managed had worked often to the disadvantage to the poorest people in the poorest countries. So the discontents that I wrote about in Globalization and its discontents were mostly in the poor countries. Today, the discontents are in the United States and in other advanced countries. So it's sort of interesting because I wrote about how the trade agreements, for instance, and the way the IMF and World Bank managed it for the advantage of the rich countries. But now the problem is within the rich countries. And the answer is simple. While the rich countries as a whole did well, a very large fraction, in some cases a majority of the citizens, didn't do very well. And globalization may have only been a part, but it was a part.
Professor Spence, I heard anecdotes about you. Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, they were all students in your class, but they all admitted to us in the press that they never attended your class.
That's true.
So, putting jokes aside, the globalization trend and people's anxiety toward it, and the gap between the rich and the poor.
That is exactly what Joe just adverted to. So this gap, which is widening almost everywhere, is widening at a very different rate depending on which country you're in. So I would say the gap is widest in the UK and highest in the US. The Europeans have done a better job of managing and mitigating the forces, both globalization and technology, that have sideswiped the middle class and produced this rising inequality. And I think what all of us believe is that our societies have to do a better job than we're doing and maybe look to some of the countries that have done it best. I think of the Northern European countries as kind of the gold standard at this point.
But is that model really followable?
Well, it's followable in principle. Whether it's followable politically is, I think, a different question.
Is that where the difficulty is?
Well, the difficulty is in the politics, but the fact that there are same economic forces basically around the world, and there's such different outcomes, is at least suggestive that it is what the difference is. The policies.
But you know, Professor Spence, even though you jointly won the Nobel Prize with Professor Stiglitz, you really don't have to agree with him, at least for today.
I try not to, but sometimes I have to.
Okay, let me go to Professor Pissarides. Thank you for teaching me how to pronounce your name. And I heard that suit you're wearing today is the one you wore during the day of the Nobel Prize award.
Yes, I'm afraid.
Well, this is a special day, I can tell.
I have bought other suits since then, but this is
I guess
the one
that
happened
is
to-
man-made in a way,
Yeah, in a way. Yeah.
not robots.
No, it was made by real men, Italians to be precise.
Men, not robots,
maybe women.
made that specific suit. And yet today, as
Yeah.
one who is researching about labor, you are doing a lot of research about what robots mean for labor around the world. Sir, what is it that is happening? Is it really the technology or the system that is a problem?
Well, what's interesting about new technology and labor markets is that the implications for jobs and skills are very similar to what we just heard about globalization. They benefit the high-skilled people much more than the low-skilled people, because the high-skilled people can use the technology, they can collaborate, if you like, with computers and robots, whereas middle and lower jobs down the scale, either their jobs get substituted by machinery, or they remain employed but they cannot use the machinery to enhance their income. So the problem of inequality gets worse when you introduce a new technology. And this is where government has a role to play to offset any of the negative effects that those market forces have on the
But
distribution
are
of income.
governments really playing that role? That's exactly what the other two gentlemen were arguing about earlier.
In Scandinavia, where governments do play that role, and generally Northern Europe does have, different countries do have different systems where they support a lot more than they do in the United States. Southern Europe has a different model of behavior where support comes mainly from the family, the extended families. But it's not a system that can work indefinitely, and we're already seeing the effect of that in the Eurozone crisis, for example, which is concentrated in Southern Europe.
But can I just say one other aspect of the government policy? It's not just the direct programs. If governments have monetary policies that keep interest rates at zero because there's not enough fiscal support, that means capital, the cost of capital, is very low. So the way we've managed our whole macroeconomics has been biased against workers.
Are you trying to introduce us to the next speaker? Because Professor Phelps really winning his Nobel Prize in economics because of the fiscal and the monetary policy related to the jobs. Is that what you're trying to do, Professor Stiglitz? Professor Phelps, come in, please. Do you really agree with Professor
that's right.
Stiglitz?
For a few years, I voiced my skepticism that monetary policy or fiscal policy make a lasting difference to the unemployment rate. But I want to come back to this horrifying phenomenon of the loss of good jobs and the collapse of wage rates at sort of in the middle of the wage distribution, the sort of middle workers. I think for sure globalization gets into the picture. But even without globalization, I think that the prime mover is the arrival of not just innovation, but innovation of a very special sort that we never had before, innovation that wipes out a whole layer of good jobs, mostly in manufacturing. Jobs that men could have without a college education, and jobs that were also meaningful to them. It involved a little bit of problem solving, involved opportunities to think how to do something better. They felt that they were playing an important role, and they lost that. And this is simply the result of something technological. All those technologies that we talk about today, the worst of them, I think, is the robots. I mean, they're phenomenally bad.
Professor Pissarides might not agree with you, but we're going to come back to him later.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The evidence, I think, that it's more technological than globalization is that if you look at the countries where the participation of men in the labor force fell the most, it was in the countries that are most innovative, United States, Britain, and France. If you look at some trading nations like the Netherlands and Germany, you don't find any fall in the participation rate of men. In fact, the participation rate of men went up.
Oh, okay, Professor, I heard you, but obviously Professor Pissarides is scratching his head while you were talking. I'm sure he has a very different approach.
Maybe he has his own numbers.
There was a different reason that made me scratch my head, actually, not disagreement with Professor Phelps.
Yeah.
No, I do agree with what he's saying. I mean, he said robots are horrible. I mean, horrible, not that they are bad. We all love them, and we want to see even more producing goods instead of people, because then people can use their time in more pleasant ways. They could take more leisure, and that. I want to go back to the example of Netherlands and Germany that was mentioned there, in that these two countries, especially Germany, is the technologically most advanced country in Europe. At least its industry is technologically most advanced. And it's the country that has the smallest number of hours of work per week, per worker. And yet it also has the lowest unemployment rate in Europe and very high participation rate. How do they do that? Well, they do it by people taking more leisure time off, because a lot of the boring routine tasks that they used to do in factories are now done by robots. And I think this is a kind of society for the future, which is a happier one than what we had before the introduction of machinery.
Probably different people have different views, Professor Pissarides. I would love to have a happy society.
You mean there are actually people who don't like leisure? They prefer to go into the factory and work?
I love the happy hours as long as possible, but there are arguments, Professor Stiglitz.
Well, I want to go back to what Chris was saying, which is that we have a dividend, you might think about it, a productivity dividend, and the question is how we're going to spend it. And I think that standard views of how people want, when they get richer, what do they want? They want to have more leisure and more goods. And if a society is working well, that is what you would expect. And that's what you get in countries like Germany and Netherlands. Now, what you see in some other countries, like the United States, where you have this enormous divide, is that you have lots of people who can't get jobs. They would like to work more, so they have leisure, but it's not the leisure they want. They're forced leisure, and that's not what we want. And on the other hand, you have people in finance working 80 hours a week, responding to the disproportionate returns of what economists call rent seeking, that the way the economy is worked is no longer based on the principles of
Professor Stiglitz, we knew about that. We knew about that from the 2008 financial crisis, but nothing seems to have changed, and even some of the legislations to address that problem now has been scrapped away as a result of political changes. So do we, gentlemen, all have the wisdom of seeing the problem, but not the guts to change the system?
Well, there's a fairly broad agreement that what's going on is not right. But to sort of get directly to populism, at least my assessment is that when you have growth patterns of the type we've had, where some people are clearly either suffering or not benefiting in the way that we described, and for whatever reason the system does nothing about it, then people get angry. And when they get angry, they say, they don't have an alternative, they just say this isn't working, and vote for anything that sounds like this isn't working. And you can see that over a fairly broad array of countries. I think that's what's going on, but the trigger isn't just the growth pattern and its problematic characteristics. The trigger is whatever causes the system not to respond.
Right.
Lack of caring, gridlock, some version of that.
And that's continuing, of course, right now, even worse.
That's right. Now, it's the politics, and different countries have different politics, but they, in some ways, it's worth noting that one of the reasons that Scandinavia has gotten better politics is that they have more equality. Because they have more equality, people understand the importance of having shared prosperity, so they can vote for policies that continue that shared prosperity, and there's a broad consensus.
The four of you, with your enormous knowledge, only talking about the developed economies, because none of you have talking about the emerging economies and the developing ones. Are the political systems now work out a possibility to change themselves from the original way, which
we don't know is quite answer.
Yeah. I know you're professors of economics,
the
but
fundamental point is that politics cannot create good jobs. Politics can throw money at the problem, but it cannot make those jobs in the checkout counter at the retail food store.
But what we can do, there are a lot of people who would, the growth sectors of our economy are not going to be manufacturing. Manufacturing output may grow, but employment is going to go down. The new sectors are going to be the service sectors.
Right.
There are many jobs that people find very meaningful, taking care of older people, healthcare workers.
But robots could do that too.
Maybe they won't bring that empathy. They won't bring the kind of empathy that education. Now, we could create a lot more jobs for these people, different levels of skills, teacher's aide versus teachers, if we wanted to. And that's a public function. But of course, we have to tax. Right. And this is a point that one of the problems is that the corporations have said, if you don't lower the taxes on us, we're going to go to someplace else. And that's been a vicious race to the bottom. And that's an aspect of globalization that has been very, very bad. And I think we have the ability to fight that.
Well, okay. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, our special program at the China Development Forum 2017. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei on CGTN, our special program from China Development Forum 2017. Earlier, we've been talking about what is going on with globalization. Is the political system going to fix the side effects of globalization? But now, let's concentrate on another topic related closely to your views. That is, what is going on with our international system? We see the United States, Professor Spence, seem to have the tendency of withdrawal from that system. What would that mean for all of us, particularly economies?
Well, so for the post-war period, we've had an architecture that has been, by and large, increasingly open and enormously beneficial. It's the core reason why the developing countries have been able to grow at these high rates. And to be honest with you, I don't think we're going to completely close that down. But the problem that has developed is that we're having trouble producing inclusive, satisfactory growth patterns in a number of countries. And while I don't think the right response is to sort of break that whole system down, we're certainly seeing cracks in it. So an honest answer would be we don't know exactly where we're going. There's a risk that we'll have a bout of destructive protectionism, I would imagine. And a better outcome would be a kind of modified version that preserves access to the global economy. Let me tell you what the real problem is.
What exactly is it?
The big players like China and the United States and Germany and the UK, etc., they can make peace with each other, negotiating agreements that are mutually beneficial. The real problem is there's a lot of countries like Botswana that aren't going to do very well negotiating with, the giants. And so what China has said, the president has said clearly, is we, and hopefully others, are going to be a sponsor of a system that creates this access and umbrella for this wide range of developing countries.
China was originally saying, the president, the word himself, he said want to be a reformer and supporter of the existing system.
Exactly.
But there has to be reform
That's
and
right.
support at the same time.
Yeah, let me just re-emphasize what Mike said, which is we have created what is called a rules-based system. And what that means is Botswana is subjected to the same rules that China or Germany is. And
China and Germany cannot be equal to one another either.
yeah, and in the law of the jungle, the guys who have more power get more for themselves, and that's totally destructive. It will create more discontents, and I think the global system will not work well. The good news, let me be an optimist for a moment. We created internationally a whole set of institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO. They're imperfect, but they are actually, given the diversity of countries, impressive. I've been a very big critic of some of the ways they've operated. They could not have been created without the support of the United States, but now that they're there, I think that they're strong enough to withstand a withdrawal from the United States. That's at least the optimistic note, and that the others will realize the importance of this rules-based system, and will fill in the gap with an even greater commitment to make it work and reform it.
You know, recently we have heard already that the Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with the visiting Secretary of State of the United States, Mr. Tillerson. And in the specific quote coming from their press release, there is going to be coordination and cooperation in both bilateral, regional, and international issues. So this might have a lot to do with the international system that we are talking about here today. Professor, just from your perspective, when the two presidents meet, likely very soon, what should they talk about? As an economist, do you think? What would you tell them if they call you tonight? Of course, probably President Trump wouldn't call you, but Chinese President Xi probably can call you.
So that's a very difficult area.
I know.
But I would say I would begin with
football and golf.
Don't get down to substance. But if they got to substance, this is what I say. Repeat the message that we've been saying about the importance of the rules-based system for the whole world, and that, but the second thing is that there are many areas of cooperation that, for instance, China has now the capital and the resources that it could, and the technology, that it could help the United States in investments, infrastructure investments, job-creating investments, and to say that we will work towards helping the United States create jobs. The United States views itself as having severe budgetary problems, and this would be a way of getting around that blockage.
Professor Pissarides.
Distinguish between the international system and what do governments do. Individual governments within their countries, I think the best way to approach it is to, for young people especially, is to support more education, have a flexible labor market, flexible, no monopolies, flexible product markets, and let the jobs be created. In the international system, I think strengthening the institutions through rule-based is essential, and then because there are ways of suppressing nationalism, which we are seeing even within the European Union, when you have thought from outside that there should be more consistency in their interests, and yet there isn't. There seems to be conflict.
And before we go, I do want to have one sentence from every one of you telling us exactly what is the logic of our world today. Where are we going? Professor Stiglitz, one sentence if you can, not a dissertation.
We are on the brink of a new world order.
As simple as that. How far
And the question is, where do we go from here? What kind of a world order is going to be?
And you, Professor Spence?
It's not dissimilar from what Joe said. I think we are now experiencing very powerful centrifugal forces within our societies and economies and globally, and we are at a kind of inflection point where we could get considerable chaos, or we could come together and sort of fight these centrifugal forces and put the system back together.
Certainly, we would love to choose the second one.
Yes.
Professor Pissarides?
Well, I'll take it up exactly from that point. That's exactly what's needed. And I have to say that my biggest concern is that I don't really trust the political leaders we have now in the major Western countries, that they would be able to carry that through to everyone's benefit. I wish they would delegate some of that to the expert institutions that we have built, because just think of who is in charge of our countries that could influence this idea. I don't think they have this broad vision to see where we're going. Even within the European Union, we don't have anyone of the founding fathers who had this vision of several years ahead, and how can we do the best for this continent. And when you put that against the United States with its current leadership, you get even more concerned.
A new wave of innovations has wiped out good jobs, created a lot of meaningless jobs. Throwing money at the problem will not create more jobs, and it will certainly not create good jobs. So that you can talk about international cooperation and rewriting the rules of the game forever, but that is the simple fact.
It is always wonderful to hear the wisdoms of the Nobel Prize winners in economics. All of you are straight talkers, and we really appreciate that. Thank you so much, professors, for being with us.